Tonight, Putin says he'll only agree to a ceasefire that addresses the conflict's roots. The Russian president's sitting down with Donald Trump's special envoy this evening, but he's made it clear he doesn't want Ukraine to use it as an opportunity to regroup. In the last few hours, Donald Trump said very serious discussions are going on, and he's urging Putin to finalize a deal. Back here, Starmer declares war on government bureaucracy and, to prove he's serious, abolishes NHS England, axing 10,000 jobs. I'll be speaking to the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. A few months ago, he said a top-down reorganisation of the NHS was the last thing he wanted to do. So what's changed? Plus, I've been talking to the UK's terror watchdog, who disagrees with the Prime Minister. The definition of terrorism shouldn't be changed after the Southport murders, but new offences are needed. And as the government talks tough on getting rid of Quangos, I'm old enough to remember the last time we were told there'd be a bonfire of them. We'll ask which ones definitely need saving. All that and more with two representatives from our own unofficial Quango, the Committee of Senior Political Pundits. Tom Baldwin and Kate Fall will be with us for the next hour. Don't worry, guys, your jobs are safe with us. It's Thursday. I'm Trevor Phillips, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Yes, evening. It is not Sunday morning. But I am here to staff the Politics Hub ship on Sophie's behalf tonight. Well, as we come on air tonight, Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's special envoy, is in Moscow. He's due to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin this evening for what we're told will be a closed format session, as the onus shift onto Putin to agree on some sort of deal to stop the fighting in Ukraine. It comes at a time when one of Ukraine's bargaining cards appears to be in jeopardy. Back in August last year, Ukrainian troops occupied several hundred square miles of territory in Kursk. Now it appears that Moscow's forces have been intensifying their campaign to push Ukrainian forces out of the border area. We got to hear from Mr. Putin at a news conference earlier, where he was careful to thank the US president for paying so much attention to Ukraine, but keen to signal he was in no hurry to go along with a truce.
We agree with the proposals to stop the hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that this ceasefire should be such that it would lead to long-term peace and eliminate the original roots of this crisis.
The questions he said he wanted answers on: what will happen in the Kursk region, and whether Kyiv would continue to receive arms if there were a 30-day truce. He also said there needed to be some sort of mechanism to control breaches of the peace.
If we halt the hostilities for 30 days, what will it mean? Will all those who were there in the Kursk region come out without a fight? Should we just let them out after all the crimes against civilians they've committed? Or will the Ukrainian leadership order them to lay down arms and simply surrender? How will it work? It's not clear.
Well, Mr. Trump has since been responding to those comments in his own inimitable way. He's been speaking in the Oval Office with NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte.
So we hopefully are going to be in a good position sometime today to have a good idea. We'll have, we know where we are with Ukraine, and we are getting good signals outside of Russia as to where we are with Russia. And hopefully they'll do the right thing. It's really humanity. We're talking about humanity. We're not talking about the money. But then you add the money to it, and, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars is being spent and really wasted so unnecessarily. It should have never happened.
Well, let's get some more reaction to what we've heard from our US correspondent, Mark Stone. He's standing by in Washington for us. But first, let's go to Ivor Bennett in Moscow. Good evening, Ivor. What are you hearing from the Kremlin?
Well, as we heard there from Vladimir Putin, he agrees in principle, apparently, to this ceasefire deal, which is no surprise in the sense that he was never going to flat out reject it. But he didn't fully endorse it either. As expected, his agreement, or his apparent agreement, comes with several strings attached. And this is no surprise, really. The Kremlin leader didn't specify what his demands are, but I think the only way he's going to agree to this is if he gets something in return. And he alluded to what he wanted by saying that any long-term peace deal, any peace deal, has to address or eliminate what he called the root causes of the conflict. And this is a frequent refrain of his. By root causes, he is referring to NATO's historical eastward expansion, which he blames for the war in Ukraine rather than his own invasion of his neighbour, of course. And I think it's an indication that the only way he's going to agree to this ceasefire deal for an immediate 30-day truce is if Russia's own security concerns are met. For example, he wants something like a cast-iron guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO, or that European peacekeeping troops from NATO member states will never be present in Ukraine in the future as part of a security backstop there. And the reason why he's reluctant to agree to this immediate truce is because right now Russia has the military advantage. You mentioned Kursk. Russia's been making lightning advances there in recent days. After 7 long months, Ukraine's incursion, Russia seems on the verge of finally repelling it. It was hugely embarrassing when it started for Vladimir Putin. It's been hugely embarrassing the fact it's gone on this long. So he's very keen to finally get rid of the Ukrainians in Kursk and make Kursk Russian again, fully Russian again. And he fears that Russia will lose that military advantage if there's a 30-day pause in the fighting, because Ukraine, of course, will get the chance to rearm and regroup. So right now he's sitting down, we understand, with Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's negotiator. But it's important to point out that Steve Witkoff was made to wait for his meeting. He arrived here around midday. It was only after that press conference, after Vladimir Putin sat down with Alexander Lukashenko, Belarus's leader, for several hours, that he then sat down with Steve Witkoff. Around 8 hours, Witkoff was made to wait. And I think this was a power play from Vladimir Putin, trying to show that he is not going to be pushed into anything. He's still the one in charge. And despite Donald Trump sounding optimistic there in the Oval Office this evening that Vladimir Putin is going to agree to this ceasefire deal, I'm not sure it's going to be that easy. I'm not sure that Steve Witkoff is going to be heading back with Putin's signature on this deal.
Ivor, thanks very much. We'll no doubt keep abreast of it from what's happening in Moscow from you as the evening goes on. Mark, Ivor's described a really rather theatrical performance from Mr. Putin. Let's go back to the other theatre over in the White House. What did you make of what Mr. Trump had to say?
Yeah, this was the visit by the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, of course, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, a man who knows Donald Trump very well. They have a good relationship. Every time there is an Oval Office moment with Donald Trump, we look at the body language, we look at the language that comes out of it, and it was clear here that, to start with, the meeting happened only moments after Vladimir Putin had finished speaking, so I think they were still catching up with what he said. But Donald Trump seemed to be pretty positive about the language. I have to say, Mark Rutte basically said nothing. He clearly took the approach that to go into the Oval Office, say as little as possible, get out of there as quickly as possible, and then do the talking over lunch when the cameras are not there. And they did have a lunch that lasted about an hour. Mark Rutte left in the last few moments, and we don't know how that private meeting went. But Mark Rutte did very little talking. Donald Trump did an awful lot of talking. Only some of it was about Ukraine. It was also about all sorts of other things, including trade. And I wonder whether behind the scenes Mark Rutte would have made the point gently, with respect to the US president, that the longer and the heavier you whack tariffs on Europe, the poorer it's going to make them. The harder it is that they are going to be for them to spend more on defence, which is what you, Mr. President, want them to do. So that's one point that he might have delegated. delicately made. But another thing, Trevor, that Donald Trump brought up in that Oval Office free for all was Greenland and the idea that he wants to annex Greenland. He wants to take it, so he said in the Oval Office. Now, in the context of Ukraine and Europe and Ukraine's anxieties, that's relevant, and it's a huge problem because you have in the White House right now, so it seems, from a European perspective, an American president who doesn't seem to understand or agree with or acknowledge the concept of a nation state. He thinks you can just transactionally or perhaps even by force take another country and make it your own, which is precisely what Putin tried to do in Ukraine. So when you have a broker in the White House who doesn't understand the concept of a nation state, well, then you have a problem when that broker is the key broker dealing with someone like Vladimir Putin.
Mark, thank you very much for that. That's the latest from Moscow and Washington. I'm sure that story is sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be Deputy Political Editor at The Spectator, James Heal, and the Editor-in-Chief at National World, Nancy Fielder. OK, well, let's bring in our dynamic duo for this evening, journalist, author and former Labour Director of Communications and Strategy, Tom Baldwin, and David Cameron's former Deputy Chief of Staff and Conservative peer, Baroness Kate Fall. Well, Kate, you've had the experience of being in the room with all of these people. I suspect most politicians aren't quite as theatrical as either Putin or... the other guy's called Trump, isn't he? What did you make? What did you make of what you've seen?
I mean, it's been such a rollercoaster couple of weeks. I think the good thing is we see the pressure mounting on Putin rather than Zelensky, who can forget that scene in the Oval Office a few weeks ago. But look, wars are easier to start than making peace, and this already looks like it's going to be pretty difficult. From our side, there's still the big questions of whether we have peacekeeping forces, whether America can give us security guarantees, what the deal is with the minerals, whether there even will be a deal. It was good to see Rutte in the room, I thought. It's very clever he kept his mouth shut, but still, we had the NATO chief there in the room, so that was good news too. So some progress, but a long way to go.
I mean, the fact that Putin hasn't just said, no, not interested, must be some cause for optimism.
Look, it's better than the alternative, isn't it? But what you've got is a sort of outline, maybe likely truce, which is the most fragile truce negotiated with Ukraine at its weakest. And what Putin wants to do now is press home that advantage and get even more concessions. The only way to stop the truce being fragile is to actually have some sort of security. That's what Keir Starmer's trying to do with the coalition of willing. He's trying to ensure that there is some European force there with a backstop of American security there, because without that, it looks like a very fragile, temporary truce, and Putin will just be able to do what he wants. That's the question now, and it feels like it's a start of a process and a very, very dangerous and tricky process.
Can I just ask you, by the way, there is a lot of commentary about the British involvement here, and I detect the hand of a former colleague of yours, Jonathan Powell, in all of this. Am I right or am I wrong?
He's never been a colleague of mine, but I think he has been heavily involved. And he's someone who doesn't like to talk about his role. He just gets on and does it. But I think
he was Tony Blair's advisor on foreign affairs and so on.
But I mean, I think he has played. I mean, after Zelensky was thrown out of the White House like a sort of failed contestant on The Apprentice, humiliated, I think the British, and particularly Jonathan Powell and Keir Starmer, played a big, big role in trying to get that back on course, get Zelensky back into talking to the White House. That's a good thing to have done, but I don't think anyone's pretending that this is some great victory in its peace in our time. It's an incredibly dangerous time too.
So 2 other points for me, I completely agree, and they are doing a good job. Look, I would just say that the problem is the Americans haven't actually said that they will offer a security guarantee. They talk about putting, their people in to work the mines, but that's not the same thing as actually having a backup force, so that's a big worry. And secondly, I agree with you, Tom, about the big worry is Russia, there's some sort of truce, and then they wait and they come back, and we've seen them take bites time and time again. So this is the beginning of a very tricky period.
Do you think, Kate, that we can play a very constructive role as a country in this, or is this really just all about the Americans and the Russians?
No, look, I think that Trump has made it clear it's not just about the Americans. So there is a sense of the transatlantic relationship in flux, and there is a role for us to step up with our European colleagues. And in some ways, that's a good thing. I mean, we probably should have spent more on defence, and so should our European allies. But we should not kid ourselves that this will be easy if the Americans don't support us.
OK. You are watching The Politics Hub. Coming up, does the definition of terrorism need changing? Not according to the man behind an independent review, but the law does need to change in the wake of the Southport attacks. And next, my interview with the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, as the government begins a new bonfire of the Quangos by abolishing NHS England.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children?
Great to see you.
Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran?
No.
Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing.
As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News. I want to be treated equally like everyone else.
It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
Very diminished by claims that you're a racist.
Question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast. It's starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Welcome back. When the Prime Minister travelled to Humberside this morning, we were perhaps expecting a few more details on how the government was planning to slim down the civil service. What nobody expected was the announcement that the biggest Quango in the world, NHS England, was for the chop. It was the NHS that brought my family to England with the Windrush wave of the early 1950s. My eldest sister wanted to train as a nurse, and the fledgling service needed all the help it could get. She ended up as a senior ward sister, the sort of fearsome lady who used to run British hospitals with a rod of iron, a starched apron and a heart of gold. The comedy actress Hattie Jacques became a national treasure after the Carry On films immortalised the phrase, "Ooh, matron." But since those days, the NHS workforce has swollen from 400,000 to 1.5 million. Today, it's run by professional managers and technocrats, and it spends almost £200 billion a year. Yet, it has never been less popular. Satisfaction levels are down to 24%, dissatisfaction up to over 50%. Today, the Prime Minister said enough. Too much bureaucracy, too many layers of organisation, and above all, too much money. Keir Starmer declared this morning that the service is coming back under democratic control. Translation, the politicians are back in charge of the operating theatre. Unsurprisingly, both Labour and Tory frontbenchers love the idea of running the service themselves. But even with the aid of AI, which is the government's default answer to every problem right now, can Dr. Wes and nurse ChatGPT pull off an operation that every time it's been tried has left the NHS in intensive care? I've been speaking to the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, about why the decision's been made and what he hopes to achieve. We'll hear from him shortly, but first, our health correspondent, Laura Bundock, has been looking at the impact on the NHS.
This is the end of an era for the NHS, now facing radical reorganisation. Ordered from the top.
I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's-length body NHS England. That will put the NHS back at the heart of government where it belongs.
NHS England was set up in 2012 under David Cameron. Its aim to provide the NHS independence from government.
The result, though, is this, a messy spaghetti soup of services, money and accountability. NHS England sandwiched in the middle between the government, the Department of Health and Social Care and clinical services, hospitals, GPs, care homes, with us, the patients at the end. And look at the red and green lines. There's overlap, duplication. And that, says the government, is dragging down efficiency.
What today is about is making sure that we deliver better value for taxpayers, generating hundreds of millions of pounds worth of savings by halving the size. And while I've been trying to build one team across the two organisations, actually just having one centre, one head office, much smaller, smarter, doing the things that only we can do nationally.
Here's part of the problem. Since NHS England began, look how much longer A&E waits have grown. The target is this yellow line, only 5% of people having to wait over 4 hours. It's not been met, though, in over a decade. Another priority is the elective waiting list. There are now 7.4 million treatments waiting to be carried out. It's the lowest since April 2023, but look how much it's grown overall, made worse by the pandemic.
The scrapping of NHS England surprised some, but there were signs. Several senior leaders, including Chief Executive Amanda Pritchard, recently stepped down. What now for the 13,000 people working here? Their future's uncertain. Uncertainty too from some whether the demise of NHS England will deliver.
The benefit, of course, of having NHS England there as the national commissioning body is that you have an organisation who is one step removed from the political day-to-day management of the health service, which, of course, is a big factor. And so I think the government is going to have to manage that transition period. It's a huge tanker that they are going to be seeking to turn. There will be bumps in the road.
There is a 10-year plan coming, but this a moment of major reform. For patients waiting, though, the structures and management don't matter. They just want to be seen and treated quickly. Laura Bundock, Sky News.
Earlier, I sat down with the Health Secretary. Let's hear what he had to say. Wes Streeting, can we just get clear what difference all this is going to make? Now that you're in charge of the NHS, are you the person I complain to as I enter my 4th year waiting for someone to look after my dodgy knees?
Well, I think people would always, in your position, complain at the Health Secretary, at the government anyway. What today is about is we've currently effectively got 2 head offices for the NHS. NHS England, the Department of Health and Social Care, taken together, 19,000 people working for 2 head offices. Back in 2010, we had 1 head office of half the size. So what today is about is making sure that we deliver better value for taxpayers, generating hundreds of millions of pounds worth of savings by halving the size. And while I've been trying to build one team across the 2 organisations, actually just having one centre, one head office, much smaller, smarter, doing the things that only we can do nationally, and ending the pretence that all of the change, all of the improvement, all of the direction in the NHS can be driven from one person sat behind a desk in Whitehall. So the biggest devolution of power in the history of the NHS, deliver better services, better outcomes for patients.
I'm going to unpack some of that, but let's just translate the first bit of it. You're going to sack, what, 9,000 or so civil servants or NHS England employees. The budget for NHS England is 200 billion. You said this morning it's going to save hundreds of billions. How's that going to happen?
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions, I beg your pardon. How's that going to happen?
Well, because we're halving the size of the workforce across both organisations as we create one head office.
So 9,000 civil servants plus out of the door.
Yes, and look, and when you put it like that, it sounds very straightforward, cold and clinical. There are thousands of decent people who work across the department, NHS England, and this will be an anxious time for them, very disruptive, and there's no way of sugarcoating the fact that there are those changes, absolutely. But we will be treating people with care and respect and the fairness that they are owed through this process. But ultimately, Trevor, yes, the NHS, my department, has a budget of over £200 billion. That's a budget the size of the government of Portugal. But I think what's happened under our predecessors is that things like the NHS England change, which former Tory health minister saying, I wish we'd had the guts to do, literally said that today, Lord Bethel. They put this in the too difficult box. Oh, it's too difficult. There's hundreds of millions of pounds worth of savings to achieve. And I know it's in the context of 200 billion, but honestly, for people watching, the idea that we wouldn't care about hundreds of millions of pounds putting that to the front line...
Before we default to this is all the Tories' fault, the Darzi review, Ara Darzi, the celebrated surgeon you commissioned, said a top-down reorganisation of NHS England is, I'm quoting here, neither necessary nor desirable. In September, you said a top-down reorganisation was, quote, the last thing you wanted to do. Yet today, that's exactly what you're doing. What happened?
Well, we're merging the two head offices. The rest of the
it's
system,
a top-down reorganisation.
The rest of the system, in terms of integrated care boards and the wide range of NHS providers, in terms of the design of that system, it will remain largely the same, even if we give people much clearer roles, responsibilities, cut through some of the bureaucracy and unnecessary regulation. We'll do all of that change. But ultimately, you know, this is the final nail in the coffin of the Andrew Lansley Conservative reforms, which Lord Darzi absolutely hammered in his report.
Yeah, I know you want to
get... the worst thing that's ever happened to the NHS.
I know you want to get back to blaming the Tories for everything.
No, Trevor, I'm putting it in context. I don't need to blame the Tories. They were voted out.
But I'm
explaining why we're making this change.
Top-down reorganisation, don't need it, don't want it. You said that in September, and that's exactly what you're doing. In fact, it's actually literally top-down. You're reorganising the top.
I'm reorganising.
I'm really asking, why did you change your mind and when?
Yeah, well, I am reorganising the top, and actually, I think those quotes you just read reveal my instincts were not to do this unless it was necessary, and I've concluded it is necessary because you can't have a situation where you've got two head offices duplicating work, man-marking each other, sometimes working against each other.
You said that.
So you can change that, make it more effective, and save hundreds of millions of pounds that we can reinvest into frontline services.
You're always very frank with me and very clear. You were wrong when you said you don't need top-down reorganisation.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate coming in wanting to make this change to NHS England. It wasn't on my list of priorities. But I recognise that in order to achieve the change I want to, this is a necessary step.
All right. One of the key functions of NHS England is to be the buyer of certain services. Are you now going to be the person who decides where the NHS spends its money, or are you going to give those powers to local boards, integrated care boards?
Yeah, I want to see far more devolution, power, responsibility devolved to the front line, and I genuinely think, if I think about what should we be doing nationally, well, we should be setting national standards so that wherever you live in the country, although services will necessarily look different to meet the needs of different communities, there should be consistent standards. We should be doing national procurement to get better value. We should be organising our approach to life sciences, medtech and research in a way that puts the NHS at the forefront of that revolution, actively driving that revolution, the way that the NHS's founders couldn't have imagined in 1948, but is ideal for the 21st century. But then in terms of the design of services and how they're provided, where they're provided, I think those decisions should be much closer
it does feel like
to the communities they're serving.
This does feel a little bit like cakeism. You say, we're going to push out power to local boards, but there's going to be national procurement and there's going to be national standards. If you are telling them what to do, where is devolution?
I don't think it's quite about telling people what to do. I mean, so, for example, in terms of how I envisage the new national organisation working, we've got to, set the standards on behalf of the public, because that is the job of the Secretary of State fundamentally, to be the public's, the patient's champion and the taxpayer's guardian. So making sure you get better outcomes and standards for patients and better value for taxpayers. But actually, nationally, the only other things we should be doing really is about giving the system the enablers, the tools that they need to do the job. And so, for example, on things like procurement, why would you have every single NHS provider in the country doing their research on what kit to buy and then negotiating at small scale with big companies when we could get better value nationally, save them loads of time and hassle, so they're buying into a central system? Those are the sorts of changes we should be deciding nationally. But locally, we've got to give people more freedom to design their own services to meet their communities' needs.
Let's talk about the thing that most people most care about. New data on waiting lists came out this morning. In your first 6 months, you cut waiting lists by just 190,000, and that's barely faster than the Tories achieved. There's still 7.4 million treatments waiting. Are you satisfied with the progress you've been making, or is this part of trying to fix that?
Well, I'd say what we've achieved in the first 8 months we've been in government, it is just the start, but we delivered 2 million more appointments as we promised, and we did it 7 months early. We've got NHS waiting lists falling 5 months in a row, and that was during peak winter pressures. Am I satisfied? And there's still a mountain to climb, so I'm not doing victory laps, but I hope it's giving people that quiet confidence and assurance that things are beginning to move in the right direction. So I'm not going to overclaim victory here, but it's not insignificant.
They only get the assurance when the waiting lists come down.
And I know that.
You've added 2 million appointments. You told me this last time we spoke, but actually you haven't cut the waiting list at all. What's going wrong?
We've cut them by over 190,000.
But in 7.5 million, come on.
It's better than our predecessors did, and
they left pretty much the same.
When the Tories were in power, they inherited the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction in history, and then they turned it on its head. And waiting lists were at record levels before the pandemic, in case any Conservatives watching start saying, "Oh no, it's the pandemic." Of course, that was a challenge. Of course, it was. But they had already set the system up to fail before the pandemic. That was the problem. What we're doing is fixing it. And of course, yes, today's challenges are part of a much wider reform agenda that's about going further and faster. Because to your challenge, Trevor, I accept that if we just continued on that momentum and trajectory for the next 4 years, we wouldn't succeed. So we do have to put the foot down on the accelerator.
Let's talk about going further and faster. Let me ask you if what this is really about is the idea that you will now take greater power over how the NHS spends its money, what it buys and where it buys it, and that actually what you really want to do is to use the NHS budget, for good reasons perhaps, to bring more private providers into the service, and that you are taking control so that you can make that happen in a way that currently the culture of the NHS doesn't allow.
Well, I think we can certainly partner with the private sector in a whole number of ways, not just on science and research and the technology and the kit that we buy, but also on the capacity that they might have to help us get waiting lists down faster. We were clear about that before the election. We're delivering this side of the election.
Yeah, but this is about more than that. This is about part privatisation, maybe.
No, with Labour, it would always be a public service free at the point of use, but we do have a wider health ecosystem in this country. And when the NHS is under the pressure that it's under, it would be daft not to use spare capacity in the private sector, not least because, there are lots of people who are now paying to go private, and it's those who can't afford it that are getting left behind. And I want to end that two-tier system. And for someone who's waiting for a hip or knee operation, I think it would stick in their craw if I was sat here as a Labour politician saying, "I'm sorry, Mrs Miggins, I know that the Spire Hospital up the road could see you tomorrow, but my left-wing principles say, no, you're going to wait another 18 months in pain and agony." Those aren't Labour principles. Labour principles are about fair and fast access to treatment, free at the point of use, with the same standard access and timely access to care as someone from the wealthiest background. And the thing I have been most proud of in our country for most of, since the NHS was founded, is you could be the richest person in the land. If you're knocked down by a bus, you'll be taken to an NHS hospital being given NHS care. And whether you're the richest or the poorest man in the country, when you fall ill, you never have to worry about the bill.
Wes Streeting, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's find out what Tom and Kate make of all of this. Let's start with the politics, Tom. Different tone from Starmer than the, moderate statesman we've seen in the last couple of weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you've seen two Keir Starmers in the last few weeks. You're seeing the very calm, reasonable Keir Starmer, which has rightly, I think, won plaudits and support around the world and across the political spectrum here. I think that's who he is. And then on the domestic stage, it seems to be a slightly different incarnation. He's now talked about being this sort of insurgent disruptor. He's attacked the civil service for sitting in a tepid bath of marriage decline. Today he was talking about the sort of flabby state. I mean, you've now got a flabby state sitting in a bath. I mean, it's a pretty horrible image. And I'm just slightly puzzled by this version of Keir Starmer, because I think the reasonable, evidence-based Prime Minister that I know is using language now which I think has got more to do with the kind of rise of reform in the polls and possibly what's going on with MAGA-land across the Atlantic. That sense you need to be kind of angry and moving fast and breaking things. And I think that's got more to do with things which I don't think are natural to him than actually kind of his core values. And I don't think he's someone who wants to insult the civil service, or particularly people who are losing their jobs at the moment. But it does come across like that. And many of the reforms announced there are sensible and long overdue. I think some of the Andrew Lansley stuff was bonkers. But it seems to me that we're having to dress it up now in a kind of almost populist-like language, which I'm not sure is good politics in the long term.
This must be quite disturbing for the Tories, Kate, that, aid cuts, benefit cuts, the NHS, the national religion being attacked, the civil servants being flabby. Is the Labour Party somewhere to the right of the Conservative Party now?
Well, I think you make a very good point that when you look at the ODA budget being used for defence, and we're talking about fairness and welfare cuts, and we're rolling the pitch now with NHS England. Look, I can see why they want to pull it back. They're looking for cuts, but they're also looking for it to be a bit more responsive. Andrew Lansley wanted to take the NHS out of politics, ironically. So let's see how well that goes when it goes back. But there's another point too, which is just about what they're actually doing, the purpose of it. I think you touched on it in the interview. What about the waiting list? Or what about social care? It does look a little bit about they're talking about the system rather than talking about the issues. Maybe they'll come on to that a bit later.
Well, I'm wondering, you both know me, I'm not a cynical person at all, but a cynically minded person might say something like, the reason Wes Streeting really wants to get his hands on things is that the NHS England leaders a couple of weeks ago said that they would cap the amount of money that could be spent on private sector provision, and he wants more. And this is his way of getting his hands on the levers so that actually he can introduce more privatisation into the health service. Ridiculous or not?
Look, I think Wes Streeting is one of a number of ministers. I think it includes a Prime Minister who have felt frustrated by the pace of change that they can bring. And, they do want to do things and they feel blocked and hindered. Now, I don't think that justifies sort of attacking civil service or people in public service. But I do think some of the pace of change needs to increase. I do think they feel that they've been held back on things, that there's been too many qualifications and nuances. Now, sometimes you do need that nuance. Sometimes you do need the expertise of people saying, well, maybe you shouldn't do that. But this is a government which is absolutely desperate to deliver change and be seen to deliver change. And if that means using more private resources to deliver NHS operations, I don't think the patients will mind.
So I think he rather indicated in that interview that he was thinking about introducing more private health. That's the first thing. And the second thing I would say, I mean, look from a Tory point of view, I saw Wes Streeting and thought that's the man with a mission, and I was looking forward to seeing what he had in mind. And we haven't actually seen that much from Wes Streeting until today. And now we've had a bit of tinkering of the system. So let's see whether we get more reforms from him going forward.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, as you talked about the language, Tom, and you're talking about Wes Streeting's reforms and so on. Maybe it's going back too far, but a lot of this language, let's cut red tape, let's bonfire the Quangos, takes me straight back to Margaret Thatcher and Norman Tebbit of the 1980s. How things have changed.
Well, it is true that they are using quite a lot of language this week in the last few weeks, which does sound quite Tory cuts. They are worried about the financial outlook and they are looking to make savings. So that's where you get, but you can say that at the same time as paying tribute to the civil service. And I worked in number 10 and they were a very impressive group of people.
Tom, is the Labour movement going to swallow this?
I think Labour movement's having to swallow a whole lot of stuff at the moment, whether it's cuts in the international aid budget, whether it's cuts in the welfare budget, a kind of a now sort of a new assault on idea of the state itself. I do think there's a danger that Labour has been focused very much on stopping a lot of votes going off to reform. It's been very focused on this threat of the populist right. But the polling I've seen suggests Labour's losing more votes to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. Now, that people might say that doesn't matter, it's not the seats that count. It does matter if Labour lose votes in a seat like Aylesbury to the Liberal Democrats, because the Tories can win it back without getting any more votes themselves. And there is a real danger, I think, that Labour are playing this sort of, it was said in the 90s and noughties that Labour took the white working class for granted. Maybe they did. I think there's a danger now that Labour are taking all those middle-class Remainers who've been voting Labour loyally for several elections, taking them for granted too.
Well, it's an interesting warning from, I hope you won't be putting it this way, Tom, from somebody who would be regarded as an uber New Labour right, actually. Anyway, I've got to bring you some breaking news now coming through to us. A little earlier on the show, we heard from both Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump. As talks take place in Moscow tonight about trying to agree some sort of ceasefire deal in Ukraine, well, in the last few minutes, we've had an update from President Zelensky in a Telegram post. He says we've heard very predictable, very manipulative words from Putin. Putin, he says, is actually preparing a rejection of the ceasefire proposal, but is scared, his words, scared, to say this directly to Trump. He says Russia is setting conditions on the ceasefire to try and delay it, or make it not happen at all. Well, let's go on to another story that's been breaking this week, which is that an independent review into the legal definition of terrorism has said it should remain unchanged. Instead, a new offence for planning non-terrorist mass casualty attacks should be created. The review came in the wake of last summer's knife attack in Southport. Axel Rudakabana killed 3 young girls and left many more with severe injuries. Police found terrorist material at his house, including an Al-Qaeda manual and homemade ricin pulp. But because there was no clear ideological motive for the attack, his offences weren't considered to be terror-related. The review also questioned whether rules around contempt of court should be changed. The riots which followed the attack were fuelled in part by wild speculation on social media about the background of the attacker. Could more details have been released by the police, and indeed the government, to prevent the vacuum of information? The man behind the review is Jonathan Hall, KC, and I sat down with him a little earlier. Jonathan Hall, you've been looking into whether the legal definition of terrorism needs to be adapted in the light of last summer's events, Axel Rudakabana, the attacks in Southport. What did you find?
Well, it's all about the extra bit of the terrorism definition and whether you should just get rid of it. So the extra bit is, like the IRA, when they used their violence, they were advancing a political cause, the cause of a united Ireland, when Islamic State were advancing their caliphate, that was a religious cause. So that's the extra bit that makes something terrorism. And the question was, could you just get rid of that altogether? What I found is you couldn't get rid of it without bringing in a whole load of violence that you just wouldn't think of as amounting to terrorism. For example, gangsters who go along to the local shop and they threaten or terrorise in order to get money from shopkeepers, football hooligans and the like. I had a go and thought, well, could you try and create some special idea of really terrorising violence? I mean, obviously what happened at Southport was absolutely terrorising. Could you say, well, let's find a legal definition of terrorising? But it's just really hard because, in a way, all violence is terrorising to the victim. It can't depend upon whether there was a witness or not or how much publicity it gets. And then I looked at what the consequences would be. We have a CT, a counter-terrorism system with the police and MI5. If you were to bring all of those people who might commit awful violence like that into the system, then either you'd overwhelm the system or it would be selling a lie to the public because the authorities couldn't possibly treat them in the same way as they do terrorism and state threats. So that was the key conclusion. It's a broad definition. It's able to deal with all the newfangled stuff, but you shouldn't expand it indefinitely.
So we're kind of stuck, really, with a definition that I guess you would say is not fit for purpose.
No, not at all, actually. I poked it around and I sort of asked the question, how does it adapt to modern terrorism that comes basically down the internet? And it's pretty good. I mean, if you compare it to some other countries, it's what they call threat neutral. It can be any ideological cause. And the challenge for authorities is, if you see some weird and wonderful cause that is being promoted through violence, you can use the terrorism definition. So I think it is adequate.
So what do you do about what we saw in Southport, which, as far as we know, doesn't have the classic political motivation?
Yeah, I think you try and draw the lessons from the counter-terrorism system that you can. The counter-terrorism system have got a pot of high-risk individuals, and some of those ones will go right to the top, and they'll be thinking, the police, what can we do to manage that one individual? Can we sort of man-mark that person? What steps can we take? Could we arrest them for terrorism, for non-terrorism? Could they be deported? Anything they can do to try and stop that person carrying out an attack. And I suppose you might be able to bring that system to this group of people who aren't terrorists, but are known to be dangerous. And again, think, what can we do? And the other thing, the last thing is, the last thing is, there is a bit of a gap. If I plot with someone else, with you, to carry out a mass casualty attack, will be a conspiracy, that's fine, that's a crime. If I carry it out, it's obviously a crime. But if I'm alone, in my room, making quite detailed attack plans, buying weapons, at the moment, that's not an offence, unless I am a terrorist.
So there's a case for a new piece of legislation that would cover that?
Correct.
So one of the things that you say in your report is that there is no supercomputer or algorithm that can magically scan all online communications and tell who is an attacker and who is a fantasist. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of talk about AI being used to detect exactly the kind of thing that you've just been talking about. Do you think that's realistic?
No. I think that you can use AI to detect the sorts of people who might, but then trying to work out of that many, many thousands of people looking at this awful stuff. An example is I looked at the case for extending the definition of terrorism to include gore. So there are people who go to these websites. There used to be a Canadian website, I think, called gore.com. It had 4 million members. And people would watch all sorts of appalling violence. I don't even want to say what it was. And this was seen on the profile of some of the attackers back in 2019. And I thought, is it possible you could say that was also a terrorism offence? The truth is, the authorities would be overwhelmed. There are so many people who look at this sort of stuff. So, I mean, you can see who looks at it. You can ask yourself, well, if someone's obsessed by violence, might they go on and do it? But actually, the numbers of people who actually go out and carry an attack are relatively small.
What difference does all this make? Because at one level, you can hear it as kind of an interesting debate amongst lawyers. Does it make any difference to what the police do or what anybody else might do?
Yeah, it does. I mean, when I was doing the report, I became aware of actually more cases than I realised of mass casualty planning and attacks. And in fact, someone contacted me within the system and said, Jonathan, you should know about this particular case. It's a live case at the moment, where it clearly did make a difference to the police. That they
so you think there's substantial amount of this kind of threat around?
There's enough to warrant a new offence, definitely. It's not. I did ask myself, am I just being theoretical, just being a lawyer looking at the statute book finding gaps? But no, there's a genuine practical reason, I think, for having a further offence.
One of the reasons all of this became controversial is because the Prime Minister, lawyer, very careful with his words, made a judgment last summer not to use the word terrorism in certain circumstances. The issue was, would it prejudice any proceedings in court and so on? Do you think we need to think again about the contempt of court laws?
I think we need to think again in two ways. I mean, the first is to make sure the laws that we've got are actually being applied. So the question is whether or not putting any information into the public domain, like you as a journalist might put something in the public domain, or the police might put something in the public domain, is that going to give rise to a substantial risk? This is the test of serious prejudice. I am slightly concerned that the way in which that test was applied was so overcautious, and I get that. The CPS don't want to do anything that might possibly jeopardise a trial, that they ignored the danger of saying very little, which is, of course, all the disinformation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it may well be there's a case for changing the law, at least perhaps the Attorney General giving guidance and saying to the police, look, I'm not going to come after you for contempt of court if you say some basic, sober facts about something, even if someone can later on make some clever argument to suggest that it's a contempt.
Do you think the Prime Minister was, with good reason, but do you think in the end it turned out, with hindsight, that he turned out to be too cautious and allowed a vacuum to develop into which all sorts of people began to attribute motives and say on social media, this has happened and that has happened, and the government basically wasn't correcting this?
Well, I actually think it's a police decision. It's the police who have the information. I mean, of course, the government are aware and will probably be consulted and things like that, but ultimately it's a police decision. We know now, and look, these things happen, we know now that the police consulted the local CPS. I think the police were quite keen, weren't they, to say that he was from a Christian background, and the CPS took a slightly an overcautious view and said no. I think the lead's got to come from the police. I don't think it's right when you've got these operational decisions for the government to be making the decisions. So it is ultimately the police. They were overcautious. I hope that can change and get better.
Jonathan Hall, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Still to come on Politics Hub, with NHS England the first to be thrown onto the flames, are there any non-government bodies that deserve to be saved from the bonfire of the Quangos? Stay with us.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8, we have a major development in the Lucy Letby investigation as the police widen their inquiries at the hospital where she worked. Plus, as the Prime Minister abolishes the body that runs the health service in England, we'll look at what that means for you. And we'll find out why Tesco is going to give away free food in the name of net zero. All that and much more on the UK Tonight from 8.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them. Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe. Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out. The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here.
In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
Exclusively on Peacock. 2 teams, 1 city, everything on the line.
Clubs off, let them rip into each other again.
Arsenal.
Oh, that's a brilliant strike!
Victory can keep their title hopes alive.
Arsenal flying!
But Chelsea need all 3 points in their own chase for top 4.
Who else?
This is the Premier League. Streaming on Peacock.
Well, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Keir Starmer says the NHS England no more is being shut down in an effort to improve efficiency in the health service. And according to Keir Starmer, NHS England will not be the last. Well, let's talk about whether there's still a place for these bodies and which ones should be saved from what David Cameron, I think, called in 2010 the bonfire of the Quangos. Kate, who are you saving from the flames?
Well, I'm going to go somewhat tactlessly with the BBC. I think soft power is going out of vogue, and I think it's an important thing. So I'm going to go, and I don't like the way, I don't want us to become like America and have, echo chambers and only watch the news and our, Fox News, and the BBC should be saved.
Yeah, I think I know what those initials stand for. I think I've heard of it, but that's what about you, Tom?
Well, I think quite a lot of Quangos do a rather good job because they provide us expertise. I think they provide a depth to a flabby state, perhaps, but I think but I think it's good flab sometimes, and not all of them are necessary, but I think some of them should be saved. So the one I'm going to nominate to be saved is the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
Yes!
Which if people don't know already, was chaired with such distinction by yourself. I would have tried to say Sky News, but it sounded too creepy, so I'll just go save Trevor's Quango instead.
Well, so for younger viewers, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, we used to have an incompetent chair, in fact, an incompetent founder chair, which was me. There is a particular point, though, about Quangos. They protect politicians, don't they? I mean, when I was in role, I used to get calls from, and I had served under Labour, Tory and Liberal politicians, saying, could you say this, could you say that, because we can't, but you can. So
I think that's right. Look, I think they're one removed. So sometimes you can fly a kite if you're running a Quango in the way that you can't if you're actually there. But, there are lots of them that do a very good job. And if they weren't a Quango, they'd probably come back into government and make a big estate. So...
Yeah, I don't think people want politicians to run everything.
Exactly.
That's a fair estimation. Let's end on that note, because that is it from us tonight. Sophie's back on Monday from 7 o'clock. Up next, it's a UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee. And I, by the way, will be back here on Sunday morning at 08:30. You can watch us with your morning coffee.